Flesh rips when you force frozen eyelashes apart. Hattie peeled her eyes open against a brutal crust of crystallized tears and hardened frost. Total darkness pressed inward from the howling wilderness. Her bare hands were entirely dead to the waking world. They lacked all feeling, locked in a stiffened, paralyzed claw around a matted ball of silver fur. Dried, freezing blood acted as a morbid glue. It bound her bare fingertips directly to the ruined coat of a mangled wolf pup. A deep, agonizing throb resonated from the very marrow of her exposed toes. Every shallow inhalation felt like dragging shattered glass directly down her windpipe. She huddled deeper into the rotting, hollowed-out root system of a dead spruce tree. The wind screamed violently through the jagged timberline above her head. It was -40 degrees outside the dead wood. Yet a miracle rested heavily against her collarbone. Blistering, impossible heat radiated fiercely from the small creature tucked beneath her chin. The pup burned like a coal-fired furnace crammed into a tiny, breathing ribcage. That unnatural warmth was actively fighting back the ice thickening inside her veins. She pressed her chapped, bleeding lips directly to the crown of its head. The animal whined softly in response. Its core temperature defied every natural law of the frozen Yukon territory. Normal animals cooled rapidly as massive blood loss took hold. This creature only grew increasingly hotter. It felt exactly like holding a glowing ember pulled straight from a blacksmith's roaring forge. Her body shook with violent, uncontrollable spasms. The violent tremors threatened to repeatedly dislodge her from the cramped shelter of the spruce roots. She clamped her rigid arms tighter around the strange beast. She absolutely refused to let go. The timeline violently snapped back in her fading, fragmented mind. Hours earlier, the sky had hung like a bruised, sickly gray canopy over Thad Boone's isolated mining claim. Hattie had been hauling a massive woven basket of stiff, frozen laundry completely across the compound. The wet long johns and heavy wool shirts had frozen solid the exact moment she pulled them from the boiling copper washpot. They clattered together loudly like wooden boards inside the heavy wicker basket. Her spine ached endlessly from the brutal, repetitive labor required to keep the camp functioning. She was merely the camp seamstress. She was the laundress, the invisible ghost who kept 20 hardened miners from succumbing entirely to trench foot and festering lice. She survived purely on meager rations and the highly hollow promise of basic safety in a lawless land. A sickening metallic clack suddenly shattered the dull afternoon routine. A piteous, high-pitched scream immediately followed the sharp, violent sound. The terrible noise originated directly from the dense thicket of black pines just beyond the camp's perimeter. Hattie dropped the heavy laundry basket without a second thought. Frozen shirts spilled chaotically across the packed dirt and snow. She sprinted aggressively toward the dark tree line. Her heavy boots punched deep, ragged holes in the fresh powder. The bitter air bit fiercely at her flushed cheeks as she rushed blindly into the dense, thorny brush. She found the source of the agony thrashing frantically within a shallow, blood-stained snowbank. A wild pup with striking, luminous silver fur was caught fast in one of Boone's heavily rusted steel bear traps. The frantic animal was far too small to naturally trigger such a massive, lethal device. A larger, rotting piece of bait had likely drawn the starving creature in. The rusted iron jaws had snapped cleanly and viciously over the creature's hind leg. Dark, crimson blood sprayed across the pristine white snow in bright, shocking arcs. The pup gnawed frantically at the unyielding metal trap. Its tiny white teeth cracked sickeningly against the cold iron. Hattie dropped heavily to her bruised knees. She reached out instinctively. She completely ignored the obvious danger of cornering a wild predator in immense, blinding pain. The pup miraculously stopped thrashing the exact moment her wool-gloved hands hovered gently over its trembling frame. Intelligent, piercing golden eyes locked directly onto hers. A profound wave of unnatural, radiating heat immediately hit Hattie's freezing face. The extreme temperature rolling off the small body was genuinely staggering. It felt precisely like opening the heavy iron door to a roaring cast-iron stove. as Hattie's bleeding fingers pry at the rusted steel teeth of the trap, digging deeper into the mystery of why this creature burns like a furnace. Make sure to hit that subscribe button to join our pack, because the woods out here are unforgiving, and you will not want to miss what hunts in them. The heavy springs of the trap refused to budge even a fraction of an inch. Hattie strained aggressively with every ounce of her remaining strength. The thick iron was frozen completely solid. She needed a heavy pry bar to wedge the jaws apart. She needed leverage she simply did not possess. Heavy, crunching footfalls suddenly approached rapidly from behind her position. The overwhelming stench of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and sweet chewing tobacco loudly announced the arrival of the camp boss. Thad Boone stood towering ominously over her kneeling form. His massive, wide shoulders were draped entirely in a thick, luxurious beaver pelt coat. He chewed lazily on a lit cigar. The cherry glowed a dull, angry red in the fading gray afternoon light. Caleb Finch trailed closely and obediently behind him. Finch was a wiry, rat-faced enforcer who constantly carried Boone's heavy Winchester rifle slung casually over his shoulder. Well, now look at exactly what crawled into the iron today. Boone spat a thick stream of dark tobacco juice directly into the snow inches from Hattie's knees. "It is just a baby," Hattie pleaded desperately. She deliberately kept her fragile body positioned squarely between the two hardened men and the bleeding creature. Finch stepped forward aggressively. He casually raised the heavy wooden stock of the rifle. "Looks like a freak to me, boss. Fur is entirely too bright for a regular timber wolf. Eyes are completely wrong." Boone took a slow, deliberate drag from his cheap cigar. His paranoid, superstitious mind constantly looked for dark omens in the woods. He utterly despised absolutely anything he could not control or understand. Finch is entirely right about this one. Thing is unnatural. It brings horrible luck to a working gold claim. "I can bandage the leg right now," Hattie said quickly, her voice cracking under the strain. "I can take it far away from the camp borders. You will never see it again." Boone laughed loudly. The sudden sound was a harsh, grinding noise entirely devoid of actual humor. "You ain't doing nothing of the sort, Widow Gallagher. Finch, take the heavy trap, throw the whole rusted rig directly into the river slush. Let the freak drown slowly." Finch offered a cruel, uneven grin that displayed rotting teeth. He slung the rifle firmly over his shoulder. He reached eagerly for the heavy iron chain attached securely to the trap's base. Total lack of agency had aggressively dictated Hattie's entire miserable existence ever since her husband died terribly in the lower mine collapse. She had kept her head down for years. She had scrubbed the bloody, filthy clothes of incredibly cruel men. She had eaten their meager scraps just to survive the deadly winter months. A sudden, violent snap occurred deep within her chest. It was not bravery rising to the surface. It was sheer, unadulterated exhaustion masquerading brightly as defiance. Hattie threw her upper body entirely over the freezing steel trap. She wrapped her thin arms tightly and securely around the burning pup. The injured creature whimpered softly. It buried its incredibly hot snout directly into the crook of her elbow. "Do not touch it," Hattie warned fiercely. Her voice trembled violently but rang surprisingly loud through the quiet trees. Finch paused immediately. He looked back nervously at Boone for clear direction. The camp boss pulled the smoking cigar slowly from his teeth. His wide face darkened instantly into a furious, bruised purple hue. Defiance acting out in his camp was a highly contagious disease. He ruled his men by absolute, paralyzing fear. A lowly seamstress publicly challenging his strict authority was an absolute death sentence. "Get up right now, Hattie," Boone commanded very softly. She completely refused to move an inch. She clamped her eyes tightly shut. She shielded the bleeding pup entirely with her own fragile ribcage. "You want to claim wild beasts in my camp?" Boone sneered viciously. His deep voice dripped with sudden, lethal calm. "Then you can go live with them in the snow." Boone stepped forward heavily. He violently grabbed the thick wool collar of Hattie's winter coat. He yanked her upward with brutal, unforgiving force. The weak seams ripped loudly under the sudden strain. He did not stop pulling aggressively until the heavy garment slid entirely off her narrow shoulders. The biting cold immediately sliced fiercely through her thin cotton dress. "Take her boots off," Boone ordered without hesitation. Finch did not delay for a single second. He tackled Hattie violently backward into the deep snowbank. She kicked and thrashed wildly against his weight. Finch pinned her thrashing legs securely with his heavy, bony knees. He violently wrenched her worn leather boots completely from her feet. He tossed them casually over his right shoulder into the brush. He grabbed her thick wool mittens next. He ripped them roughly from her frozen hands. Hattie scrambled frantically backward. She clutched the heavy pup and the attached iron trap tightly against her chest. The freezing snow burned her bare, exposed feet, exactly like standing on white-hot coals. "You are killing me out here!" she screamed wildly. The bitter, howling wind instantly snatched the desperate words directly from her mouth. "I am enforcing the camp rules," Boone replied coldly. He turned his broad back on her instantly. He wrapped his luxurious fur coat significantly tighter around his massive frame. "Get her off my claim immediately. If she steps 1 foot past the perimeter line, shoot her directly in the stomach." Finch shoved Hattie violently in the center of her chest. She tumbled awkwardly backward into the deep, unbroken powder existing just outside the camp boundary. The heavy trap dragged harshly through the snow. The thick chain clinked a morbid, metallic rhythm against the ice. Finch racked the lever of the Winchester loudly. He chambered a shiny brass round. He leveled the cold steel barrel directly at her face. Hattie dragged herself backward into the shadows. The pup whimpered continuously. Its blistering heat seared completely through the thin fabric of her dress. The cold began its highly deadly work almost immediately. Her wet stockings froze solidly to her pale skin within mere seconds. The wind ripped violently through the tall trees. It carried the lethal chill of the incoming blizzard straight into her bones. She had absolutely no coat. She had no heavy boots. She had absolutely no hope of surviving the night. She dragged the incredibly heavy iron trap and the bleeding creature deep into the darkening wilderness. The vivid memory faded away completely. It was replaced once again by the agonizing reality of the hollowed spruce root in the present moment. Hattie's pulse was severely slowing to a sluggish, dangerous crawl. Her final breaths were shallow, rattling wheezes escaping her blue lips. The intense pain in her bare feet had completely vanished. That was the most terrifying, final sign of all. The deadly numbness was climbing rapidly past her frozen ankles. It was creeping steadily and silently up her pale calves. Soon, the creeping cold would finally reach her slowing heart. The pup's supernatural, furnace-like heat was the absolute only barrier keeping the deadly frost away from her vital organs. She buried her face deeply into the silver fur. The metallic smell of copper blood mixed heavily with the clean, sharp scent of crushed pine needles. Suddenly, the injured pup lifted its heavy head from her chest. Its glowing golden eyes intensely pierced the oppressive darkness of the cramped hollow. The animal let out a incredibly low, vibrating growl. The sound rumbled deep within its small chest. It was not a sound of pain or fear. It was a sound of absolute recognition. Hattie felt a sudden, terrifying tremor violently shake the frozen earth beneath her back. The deep snow began to crunch heavily outside her tiny, hidden sanctuary. These were absolutely not the hurried, sloppy footsteps of Caleb Finch coming lazily to finish the job. These footfalls were impossibly massive. They were deliberate, heavy, and completely unhurried by the raging storm. Each step landed heavily with the devastating weight of a falling redwood tree. The frozen ground literally shook. The rotting wood of the dead spruce tree vibrated violently against her frozen spine. She held her shallow breath. The screaming wind outside seemed to die instantly in submission. An unnatural, suffocating stillness descended heavily upon the dark forest. A towering shadow completely blocked out the meager, silvery moonlight, barely filtering into the hollow. The massive silhouette was impossibly broad. It filled the entire entrance of the rotting root system effortlessly. Hattie braced herself internally for the fatal blow. She fully expected the cruel, bloated face of Thad Boone to lean down aggressively with a burning lantern. She fully expected the cold steel barrel of a Winchester rifle to press roughly against her forehead. The massive shadow stepped casually forward into the starlight. It was certainly not Boone coming to finish her off. If you examine the raw, suffocating tension captured in Photo 2026-08-22-09-2020-30 to.jpg, you will understand the exact posture of sheer, breathless terror gripping her bones at this very second. The dominant figure standing casually over her was a towering, impossibly broad man. He was clad heavily in dark, thick iron armor and massive black bear furs. He did not look entirely human. His jaw was clenched tight. His features were sharp and strangely aristocratic, but completely brutal in their design. He tilted his head downward very slowly, glowing. Golden eyes identical to the bleeding pup in her arms locked fiercely onto her freezing face. The suffocating smell of crushed pine needles mixed heavily with raw ozone and fresh, metallic blood suddenly flooded Hattie's freezing lungs. A towering giant dropped heavily to one knee directly beside her fragile, trembling body. Dense snow compacted violently beneath his massive, armor-clad legs. Absolute darkness swallowed the cramped hollow completely as his immense shoulders blocked out the silvery starlight entirely. He leaned forward deliberately into the rotting spruce root. His breathing sounded like a massive bellows feeding a dark underground forge. A colossal hand reached slowly toward her exposed, frost-bitten throat. Thick, scarred leather wrapped tightly around his massive knuckles. Sharp, entirely blackened nails extended aggressively from the worn fingertips of the dark gloves. She squeezed her eyes completely shut against the brutal crust of ice forming quickly on her lashes. The raw physical tension peaked painfully in the dead space existing between them. She waited desperately for the fatal snap of her fragile neck. She expected the brutal, crushing weight of his unnatural strength to end her miserable existence instantly. The killing blow never came. Instead of striking downward, the terrifying giant hovered mere inches from her pale face. He inhaled deeply through his broad nose. He deliberately took in the scent of her sluggishly fading pulse. He smelled the fresh, bright copper of his stolen heir's blood staining her stiffened cotton dress. He instantly recognized the stark, undeniably human sacrifice radiating fiercely from her freezing skin. This fragile creature had surrendered her very last ounce of bodily warmth to shield his dying son from the bitter frost. The towering predator shifted his massive weight backward into the deep snow. Von Sterling reached up slowly toward his incredibly broad shoulders. He grasped the heavy, iron-wrought clasp, securing the massive black bear cloak securely around his thick neck. The heavy metal mechanism clicked sharply in the frozen air. He stripped the enormous, enchanted fur completely away from his armored body in a single, perfectly fluid motion. He dragged the impossibly heavy garment directly over Hattie's shivering, paralyzed form. Magical, life-saving heat slammed instantly into her failing limbs. The sensation was absolutely staggering. It felt exactly like being plunged directly into a tub of boiling summer water. The enchanted fur radiated a blistering, golden warmth that completely defied the -40-degree ambient temperature. The brutal ice aggressively binding her bare toes began to melt instantly into harmless, warm water. The violent, uncontrollable tremors racking her spine slowed almost immediately as the deep chill evaporated. She opened her eyes very cautiously. The heavy bear fur smelled strongly of cedar wood, wild storms, and apex power. It enveloped her entirely like an impenetrable, supernatural fortress. Her stiffened fingers finally twitched with returning circulation. The agonizing sting of thawing blood rushing rapidly back into her frost-bitten extremities forced a sharp gasp from her cracked lips. Vaughn turned his imposing, terrifying attention entirely away from her face. He reached his massive, leather-clad hands directly toward the bloody steel trap. The rusted iron jaws remained locked viciously around the silver pup's delicate hind leg. Hattie had strained desperately against the heavy metal for seemingly endless hours. Her bleeding, frozen fingers had accomplished absolutely nothing against the cold steel. The King of the Woods did not require leverage. He grasped the thick, frozen iron base firmly with both hands. His armored gauntlets scraped harshly against the rusted steel surface. He did not grunt or strain. He simply pulled his massive hands apart in a sudden, brutal exertion of terrifying physical dominance. The heavy steel trap literally exploded under the sheer force. Thick metal snapped cleanly in half, exactly like dry, brittle kindling cracking over an open fire. Rusted shrapnel flew violently into the surrounding snowbanks. The heavy iron chain attached securely to the trap dropped uselessly to the white ground. The silver pup whined softly in sudden, profound relief. Vaughn discarded the ruined halves of Boone's terrible trap lazily into the thorny brush. He reached down with incredible, unexpected gentleness. He gathered the wounded, bleeding pup carefully into his massive, armored palms. The sharp contrast between his lethal, blackened nails and the soft silver fur was visually jarring. He lifted the burning creature up directly level with his sharp, aristocratic face. He closed his glowing golden eyes slowly. He pressed his broad forehead directly against the small, bloody crown of the injured pup. A silent, ancient communication passed instantly between the terrifying monarch and his stolen heir. The dense air surrounding them vibrated continuously with a low, imperceptible frequency. The frozen spruce needles shook slightly in response to the invisible exchange taking place. Hattie watched silently from the absolute safety of the enchanted bear fur. She remained completely paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated awe. Her mind spun wildly as the horrific reality finally settled heavily into her thawing bones. She had not merely thrown her miserable life away to save a starving stray dog. She had actively shielded a supernatural entity of immense, terrifying importance. Vaughn slowly lowered the silver pup back down into the hollowed roots. He tucked the small creature securely against Hattie's warming side. The pup curled tightly into a silver ball against her ribs. He stood up slowly from the crushed snow. His full, terrifying height was finally revealed against the jagged, dark timberline. He turned his broad back completely away from the hollowed spruce tree. His massive, armored body faced directly down into the steep valley. The distant, glowing yellow lights of Thad Boone's mining claim flickered weakly at the very bottom of the steep ridge. Plumes of dark, greasy wood smoke rose lazily from the tin chimneys of the fortified mess hall. Vaughn stared down intensely at the isolated human settlement with pure, apocalyptic rage. The sheer intensity of his wrath seemed to actively alter the physical environment around his boots. The biting wind suddenly changed direction entirely. It began blowing heavily down the mountain. The strong gusts carried his terrifying scent straight toward the oblivious camp. He began his deadly descent through the deep, unbroken powder. His heavy, armored boots moved with blinding, unnatural grace. He stalked forward relentlessly, like an apex predator perfectly designed for absolute slaughter. The frozen, brittle branches of the dead pine trees did not snap loudly against his dark iron pauldrons. The dense forest itself seemingly yielded completely to his heavy, imposing presence. Thorny bushes actively parted smoothly around his striding legs. The loud crunch of his massive footfalls completely vanished into the falling snow. He became a silent, towering ghost, descending rapidly upon the doomed men below. Hattie remained perfectly still beneath the massive fur cloak. She watched his dark silhouette disappear slowly into the blinding whiteout conditions. A profound, thrilling anticipation began to replace the suffocating dread in her chest. Deep inside the fortified timber walls of the main mess hall, the atmosphere was brutally stifling. The large room smelled heavily of rotting cabbage, unwashed bodies, and cheap kerosene oil. A massive cast-iron stove sat squarely in the dead center of the wooden floorboards. It radiated an oppressive, dry heat that forced the men to sweat profusely through their filthy long johns. Heavy oak tables were scattered carelessly across the wide room. Discarded tin plates and stained, bent playing cards littered the heavily scratched wooden surfaces. The unwashed miners had retired early to their separate bunkhouses. Only the camp elite remained awake in the main hall. Thad Boone sat extremely comfortably near the roaring iron stove. He felt completely insulated from the lethal consequences of his cruel decisions. He held a dented tin cup filled entirely to the brim with amber, cheap whiskey. His heavy beaver pelt coat hung loosely over the wooden back of his sturdy chair. He picked his rotting teeth lazily with a splintered matchstick. Caleb Finch sat directly across from him at the greasy table. The wiry enforcer was aggressively whittling a small piece of soft pine with an incredibly sharp hunting knife. Shavings of pale wood fell constantly onto his dirty leather boots. "Reckon she is completely frozen solid by now," Finch mumbled lazily. He did not bother to look up from his repetitive carving. Wind is howling something fierce out there in the dark. Boone laughed loudly. He took a long, greedy swallow of the burning alcohol. The strong liquor spilled slightly over his unshaven chin. "Widow Gallagher brought it entirely upon herself today. You cannot tolerate blatant insubordination on a working gold claim. The other men would absolutely stop digging the very next day. They would think I went entirely soft on them. She was mighty stupid throwing herself aggressively over that rusted trap." Finch flipped the sharp knife expertly between his bony fingers. Thing looked awful sick anyway, burning up fiercely with some kind of unnatural fever. Animals die violently in the woods every single day. Boone wiped his wet chin aggressively with the rough back of his dirty hand. "It is the natural order of things out here. Strong survive the frost. The weak freeze quietly in the dark. She was always entirely too weak for the Yukon." Finch nodded lazily in complete agreement. He reached across the sticky table to grab the heavy whiskey jug. "She made a decent rabbit stew, though. I am going to miss having a proper seamstress around here fixing my ripped shirts." Boone kicked his heavy leather boots up comfortably onto the flat edge of the iron stove. He settled much deeper into his sturdy wooden chair. The kerosene lamps hanging securely from the ceiling beams flickered brightly overhead. The camp boss felt entirely secure behind his thick, iron-reinforced oak doors. He had heavily fortified the main hall specifically against desperate claim jumpers and roving, desperate wolf packs. The thick timber walls were completely bulletproof. The heavy crossbars securing the main entrance were forged explicitly from solid steel. He genuinely believed he was the absolute, unquestioned king of his isolated, frozen domain. The brutal, deadly irony of his extreme arrogance was entirely staggering. The very first sign of imminent, catastrophic trouble was the sudden change in the brutal weather outside the heavy log walls. The constant, shrieking howl of the incoming blizzard died instantly. It did not fade away gradually over several long minutes. It stopped completely dead. Total, terrifying silence slammed violently into the perimeter of the mining camp. The sudden lack of noise was immensely disorienting. It felt exactly like a heavy, suffocating woolen blanket being thrown aggressively over the entire building. Boone slowly lowered his tin cup to the scratched table. He frowned deeply at the heavy oak doors. He strained his ears aggressively to hear the familiar wind. He heard absolutely nothing. The deep silence was heavy, oppressive, and entirely unnatural. Finch stopped whittling immediately. He gripped the wooden handle of his hunting knife with sudden, white-knuckled intensity. The wiry enforcer looked extremely nervously toward the frosted window panes. "Wind died," Finch whispered anxiously. Before Boone could formulate a completely dismissive response, sheer panic erupted violently in the stables just outside the hall. The heavy draft horses began screaming loudly in absolute, unadulterated terror. The massive animals slammed their heavy iron-shod hooves viciously against the wooden walls of their narrow stalls. The loud, rhythmic thud of splintering wood echoed sharply across the quiet, frozen camp. They were kicking frantically to escape whatever was suddenly standing completely still in the yard. Horses did not simply spook at the sudden lack of wind. They reacted violently to the undeniable, primal scent of apex predators. "Grab the rifle right now," Boone commanded sharply. His deep voice lost its arrogant swagger entirely. Finch scrambled awkwardly out of his wooden chair. He lunged desperately for the heavy Winchester, leaning casually against the far wall. His dirty boots slipped slightly on the greasy floorboards. He racked the heavy lever aggressively backward. The loud, metallic clack of the chambering round sounded incredibly small and utterly pathetic against the mounting terror outside. The horses screamed even louder. Their frantic cries reached a high-pitched, hysterical frequency. One of the thick wooden stable doors shattered completely under a desperate, violent kick. Boone stood up very slowly from his comfortable chair. He reached nervously for the heavy revolver strapped securely to his thick hip. He drew the heavy gun with shaking, sweaty fingers. He leveled the cold steel barrel directly at the exact center of the reinforced oak doors. The thick steel crossbars holding the heavy entrance shut suddenly felt entirely inadequate. He swallowed hard. The cheap whiskey burned fiercely in the back of his dry throat. He backed away slowly from the iron stove. The intense heat of the fire suddenly felt completely suffocating. The heavy, iron-reinforced oak doors of the mess hall buckled inward violently with a sickening groan. A massive fist struck the solid wood completely from the outside. The brutal impact sounded exactly like a heavy cannonball hitting a frail wooden ship. The thick timber splintered just enough to create a jagged, open crack in the center of the heavy doors. The terrifying damage instantly revealed a single, glowing golden eye staring through the dark. The invincible barrier of the camp has just been shattered by an unstoppable force, and the brutal massacre of the guilty is seconds away. The heavy iron hinges screamed violently before snapping completely apart like sudden cannon fire. Solid oak doors ripped entirely from the fortified timber wall. A brutal blizzard of jagged wood splinters blasted forcefully into the stifling room. Blinding white snow followed the flying shrapnel immediately. The frigid powder collided aggressively with the whiskey-soaked heat of the main mess hall. Kerosene lamps swung wildly from the heavy ceiling beams. The sudden, violent draft extinguished 3 of the glass lanterns instantly. Deep shadows aggressively swallowed the corners of the wide room. The roaring cast-iron stove hissed loudly as wet snow landed directly onto its blistering metal surface. Von Sterling stepped confidently through the ruined entryway. He did not rush or run. He simply walked into the flickering amber light of the remaining kerosene lamps. The towering king brought the absolute freezing terror of the dark woods directly inside the fortified walls. Snow clung heavily to his thick iron armor. His dark leather boots crunched loudly over the splintered remains of the heavy oak doors. Caleb Finch completely lost his mind. Panic completely overrode any rational thought left in the enforcer's wiry frame. He raised the heavy Winchester rifle awkwardly to his narrow shoulder. His dirty fingers fumbled desperately with the cold steel trigger. He squeezed the metal tight. A deafening gunshot roared loudly inside the enclosed wooden space. Blinding yellow muzzle flash illuminated the sheer terror stretching across his pale face. The brass casing ejected sharply and clattered noisily against the greasy floorboards. The heavy lead bullet flew completely true. It struck Vaughn directly square on his left iron pauldron. The lethal projectile flattened uselessly upon impact. It deflected away with a high-pitched metallic ping. The crushed lead buried itself harmlessly into a thick roof support beam. Vaughn did not flinch. He did not even break his casual, predatory stride. His glowing golden eyes locked entirely onto the terrified shooter. He crossed the wide distance between the doorway and the wooden table in a horrifying blur of unnatural speed. Finch tried frantically to rack the lever for a second shot. He never finished the mechanical motion. A massive, leather-clad hand moved brutally through the smoky air. Vaughn struck Caleb with a casual backhand. The violent blow carried the devastating force of a swinging sledgehammer. Armored knuckles collided viciously with the heavy wooden stock of the Winchester. The sudden impact drove the rifle aggressively back into the enforcer's fragile arms. Both of Finch's wrists shattered instantly with a sickening double crack. The sharp sound of breaking bone cut sharply through the ringing silence following the gunshot. Finch collapsed heavily backward over his wooden chair. He hit the greasy floorboards hard. He screamed hysterically into his ruined, useless hands. The broken rifle clattered harmlessly into the far corner of the dusty room. The sudden influx of sub-zero air rapidly cooled the stifling mess hall. The oppressive stench of rotting cabbage and stale tobacco smoke vanished instantly. It was replaced entirely by the raw scent of fresh pine, wet iron, and ozone. Vaughn stood perfectly still amidst the swirling indoor snowfall. He looked down slowly at the writhing enforcer on the floor. He offered absolutely no words. He simply observed the broken man like a farmer inspecting a crushed locust. The sheer indifference radiating from the armored giant was vastly more terrifying than his violent speed. He slowly turned his massive head toward the cast-iron stove. Thad Boone witnessed the complete destruction of his best man in a fraction of a second. His paranoid bravado shattered completely. The heavy Colt revolver in his sweaty hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy and entirely useless. He realized his firearms meant absolutely nothing against this towering apex predator. His hired thugs were fragile toys. The thick timber walls of his fortress were basically paper against this monster. The camp boss dropped the heavy pistol. The gun hit the floor with a dull thud. He collapsed forcefully onto his bruised knees. The sudden impact rattled his heavy bones against the floorboards. "Please!" Boone begged frantically. His deep voice cracked horribly. He scrambled awkwardly across the rough wooden planks. He crawled directly toward the terrifying giant on his hands and knees. "Whatever you want is entirely yours. Just name your absolute price." Vaughn stared down silently at the pathetic, groveling figure. He did not move a single muscle to acknowledge the frantic pleading. Boone reached frantically into the deep pockets of his luxurious beaver pelt coat. His thick fingers grasped desperately for anything possessing value. He yanked out 3 heavy leather pouches securely tied with thick rawhide string. He fumbled violently with the tight knots. His sweaty thumbs failed to untie the leather bindings. He resorted to tearing the soft material open with his rotting teeth. Raw, unrefined gold dust spilled aggressively onto the dirty floorboards. Bright yellow flakes mixed directly with the muddy snow and spilled whiskey. The precious metal sparkled faintly in the dim kerosene light. "Gold," Boone cried out desperately. He scooped handfuls of the shining dust up toward the king. The yellow flakes stuck stubbornly to his sweaty, shaking palms. "I have pounds of it buried deep under the main bunkhouse. You can take every single ounce." Vaughn looked down at the human currency. His glowing eyes registered absolutely nothing but cold disgust. Boone threw the empty leather pouches aside. He reached violently into his thick wool shirt. He retrieved a tightly folded stack of thick parchment paper. He held the documents up with violently shaking hands. "These are the official deeds," Boone stammered wildly. "Signed and fully recognized by the territorial governor. This entire valley belongs to me on paper. I will sign it all completely over to you right now." The King of the Woods stepped forward heavily. His iron boot crushed the scattered gold dust deeply into the wooden planks. He looked at the paper deeds with ancient boredom. Human laws held zero authority over the falling snow. Territorial borders meant absolutely nothing to a creature who hunted before the very first map was ever drawn. "Take it all!" Boone screamed frantically. Spit flew wildly from his chapped lips. He dropped the paper deeds into the growing puddle of melted snow. Vaughn finally moved. He leaned down slowly until his broad face hovered just inches above the weeping camp boss. He did not reach for the yellow gold. He did not look at the official territorial documents. He reached firmly forward and grabbed the thick wool collar of Boone's heavy shirt. The leather-clad fist twisted tightly. A soft crunch of heavy boots on fresh snow drew Boone's terrified eyes toward the ruined entryway. The blizzard outside raged furiously around a completely unexpected figure standing squarely in the broken doorway. Hattie entered the breached mess hall very slowly. She walked upright and entirely unharmed. She stepped carefully over the splintered wreckage of the heavy oak doors. She moved safely under the absolute protection of the king's massive enchanted cloak. The thick black bear fur draped heavily over her narrow shoulders. It dragged slightly across the floorboards behind her. The magical golden heat, radiating from the garment, visibly distorted the freezing air around her face. She cradled the healing silver pup tightly against her chest. The small creature had stopped bleeding completely. Its bright golden eyes surveyed the ruined room with intense, intelligent curiosity. The power dynamic inside the dark hall inverted permanently in that exact second. Boone stared up at the camp seamstress in sheer, unadulterated terror. He instantly recognized the heavy bear pelt. He saw the silver pup resting comfortably in her arms. The horrific realization finally connected deep within his paranoid mind. She had not just survived the deadly frost. She had actively summoned the very wrath of the forest itself. Finch stopped screaming momentarily. He peered through his tears at the small woman. He clutched his ruined, useless wrists tightly against his chest. The wiry enforcer pushed himself weakly backward against the wall. He wanted to melt entirely into the shadows. He wanted to completely disappear from her sight. Hattie stopped walking near the center of the room. She looked down at the men who had casually discarded her just hours before. She felt no pity. She felt absolutely zero remorse for the extreme violence that had just shattered their fortress. The grueling years of scrubbing their filthy clothes vanished from her memory. The constant fear of Boone's cruel authority evaporated completely into the cold air. She held their miserable lives securely in her frostbitten hands. She only needed to utter a single word to see them both torn entirely to shreds. She chose to remain completely silent. She held the pup closer to her warm collarbone. She simply stared down at the weeping camp boss with cold, dead eyes. The total absence of forgiveness in her pale face terrified Boone more than the armored giant holding his collar. He recognized the exact look. It was the same hollow gaze he had given her when he banished her into the blinding whiteout. Vaughn tightened his brutal grip on the thick fabric of Boone's shirt. He hauled the massive man forcefully upward. Boone weighed well over 200 pounds. The king lifted him entirely off the floorboards with a single arm. Boone kicked frantically in the air. His heavy leather boots knocked uselessly against Vaughn's thick iron armor. The king turned sharply toward the broken doorway. He dragged the screaming claim boss roughly across the room. Boone's heavy boots scraped loudly against the wooden planks. The iron toes caught aggressively on the exposed nail heads. He clawed desperately at the giant's unyielding forearm. His fingernails broke violently against the dark leather gauntlets. Vaughn ignored the pathetic resistance completely. He walked deliberately out of the ruined mess hall. He stepped heavily back into the howling, freezing wind of the open camp. Hattie followed closely behind them. She stepped carefully over the discarded Colt revolver. She walked past the scattered, meaningless gold dust. She emerged safely into the center of the compound. The wind whipped violently around her. The enchanted bear cloak blocked the chill entirely. She felt wonderfully warm. She felt completely untouchable. Vaughn stopped squarely in the absolute center of the packed dirt yard. Snow whipped aggressively across his armored shoulders. He threw Boone violently onto the frozen ground. The camp boss landed heavily on his back. He gasped desperately for air. The freezing wind knocked the breath completely from his lungs. Without uttering a single syllable, Vaughn began executing the precise sentence. He reached firmly down and grabbed the thick lapels of Boone's luxurious beaver pelt coat. The heavy garment was a powerful symbol of the boss's absolute authority. It was the warmest item within 100 miles. Vaughn yanked aggressively upward. The thick seams ripped loudly. The sound echoed the exact noise of Hattie's thin coat, tearing just hours before. The king stripped the heavy fur violently from Boone's wide shoulders. He tossed the incredibly expensive garment carelessly into the muddy snow. Boone shivered instantly. The biting wind sliced fiercely through his sweat-soaked shirt. "Wait," Boone pleaded weakly. His teeth began to chatter violently. "You cannot do this." Vaughn did not pause to listen. He stepped heavily onto Boone's left ankle. He pinned the man's leg securely to the frozen earth. He grabbed the thick leather of the right boot. He wrenched the sturdy footwear completely off. He tossed the boot over his wide shoulder. It disappeared entirely into the deep, thorny brush. He repeated the brutal motion on the left leg. Both of Boone's thick wool socks were instantly exposed to the -40-degree air. The wet fabric began freezing solid almost immediately. The king reached down one final time. He grabbed Boone's thick leather work gloves. He ripped them forcefully from the man's hands. He discarded them carelessly into the rising snowdrifts. The exact cruelty was perfectly mirrored. The sentence was completely finalized. Hattie watched the entire process in absolute dead silence. She stood perfectly still amidst the raging storm. She offered absolutely no mercy. She did not look away from the horrific sight of the powerful man being systematically reduced to freezing prey. Boone curled tightly into a pathetic ball on the ground. He tucked his bare hands desperately under his armpits. He pulled his freezing toes tightly toward his chest. He looked up at Hattie through the blinding snow. He silently begged her for a single ounce of the compassion he had aggressively denied her. She simply pulled the heavy, enchanted fur significantly tighter around her own warm shoulders. She nestled her chin comfortably against the sleeping silver pup. The howling wind seemed to scream much louder across the open yard. Boone began to weep openly into the packed snow. His tears froze rapidly against his red cheeks. The deadly numbness started climbing quickly up his bare calves. The exact agonizing process Hattie had barely survived was now taking complete hold of his heavy body. He realized with absolute, crushing certainty that he would not survive until sunrise. The cold did not care about the paper deeds scattered on the floorboards. The frost cared absolutely nothing for the gold dust buried beneath the bunkhouse. The northern winter only respected whoever possessed the fire. A low, vibrating growl suddenly echoed deeply from the dark tree line. Boone snapped his terrified head toward the black pines. The forest edge was completely shrouded in deep shadow. Then a single pair of glowing golden eyes opened slowly in the dark. The bright yellow orbs floated silently about 4 feet off the ground. Another pair opened slightly to the left. Then 3 more appeared quickly on the right. Within mere seconds, 24 pairs of luminous golden eyes stared hungrily out from the dense, thorny brush. The rest of the ancient lycanthrope pack had finally closed in heavily on the isolated human camp. They did not step fully into the light. They remained completely hidden within the protective shadows of the tall spruce trees. Their heavy, synchronized breathing sounded exactly like a rising storm front. The low growls resonated powerfully through the frozen earth. They were patiently waiting for their king to formally relinquish the doomed prey. Vaughn turned his broad back completely on the whimpering camp boss. He did not look toward the terrified enforcer hiding inside the ruined hall. He simply walked slowly over to Hattie's side. The towering giant offered her a deeply respectful nod. He gently placed his heavy, armored hand squarely on her shoulder. He guided her smoothly toward the safety of the deep, untouched woods. Hattie did not look back at the mining claim. She turned her face forward into the dark, welcoming trees. The impossible heat of the king wrapped her securely, like impenetrable armor. She carried the sleeping air tightly against her heart. They walked together into the freezing darkness. The dense pines actively parted smoothly to allow their unhurried passage. Behind them, the biting wind aggressively swallowed Thad Boone's final, desperate screams just before the dark forest went permanently silent.
That exact freezing silence is exactly where we leave the camp boss tonight, sinking deeply into the cold reality of frontier justice. As Hattie walks away wrapped safely in the king's heat, I want to know exactly where you are watching this story from, so drop your city or country down in the comments below. If you felt the absolute chill of the Yukon in this one, make sure to hit that like button, share this tale with someone who loves dark revenge, and subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss our next journey into the woods.